Today on the podcast, we continue our story of Larry Watkin, who worked with Walt to create the first wave of Disney live-action features in the 1950s. Watkin was one of the key people who helped Walt move his company beyond animation and into new fields. Since we started this series a little over a month ago, a few people have written in to ask where they can screen all of these movies. The two most significant films that we've talked about are on Disney+. There you can find lovely high-definition transfers of Treasure Island, Watkin's first film for Disney, and Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which we will talk about this week and next, which was Watkin's most important film for Disney. I should also point out that the version of Darby O'Gill on Disney Plus is the one that has the later dubbing, which we will talk about next week. But Darby O'Gill is one of Walt's best live-action features, along with Mary Poppins and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Anyone can easily click onto Disney Plus to watch both of these features, and if you want to explore Walt and Watkin's early live-action offerings, that's where I would start. You can also find a high-definition presentation of the 1952 version of Robin Hood on Disney Plus. But beyond that, it becomes a little bit tricky. As far as I know, there are no publicly available high-definition versions of The Sword and the Rose or Rob Roy, but these are available on DVD and as standard def presentations for rental on Amazon, iTunes, and elsewhere. The DVDs are out of print, so if you're looking for them, you'll likely need to search third-party sellers on a site like eBay. The Great Locomotive Chase really should be on Disney Plus, in my opinion. As I mentioned, I think the two most important films from the Watkin era are Treasure Island and Darby O'Gill, but The Great Locomotive Chase easily comes in as third. It's a tightly plotted, well-crafted film that highlights Walt and Watkin's approach to live action in the mid-1950s. You can find this as a high-definition rental on Amazon, iTunes, and elsewhere. So, if you're interested in watching or re-watching some of the films that we've been talking about recently, those would be the 2 or 3 titles I'd start with. Darby O'Gill, then Treasure Island, and then third, The Great Locomotive Chase. And for you completionists out there, you also now have a roadmap on how to find some of the remaining Watkins projects so you can watch them at home. But today on the podcast, we start in on a discussion of the most important of the Watkins films, the one that he and Walt worked on for a dozen years, Darby O'Gill and the Little People. So, if you're ready, let's get back into our story. Following The Great Locomotive Chase, Larry Watkin continued to work as a scriptwriter on historical dramas that explored American history, such as The Light in the Forest, which tells the story of a young white man who in the 1760s was raised by Native Americans, and 10 Who Dared, which tells the story of John Powell's 1868 expedition down the Colorado River and through the Grand Canyon. These dramas adapted the storytelling style of the earlier UK films, in which a historical event was recreated with fictional scenes and dialogue to fill in gaps in the historical record. On the one hand, then, this new wave of historical dramas might seem as though it was nothing more than a practical adaptation of the UK films for US subjects. But beyond this, in the mid-1950s, Walt moved through a period where his personal interests were deeply tied to American history. For America as a whole, the post-war years following America's success in Europe fueled a resurgence in patriotism, national pride, and interest in the country's history, which was also reflected in Walt's renewed engagement with the subject. In addition to the films on which Larry Watkin worked, Walt also created Johnny Tremaine, a story of the American Revolution, and Old Yeller, a story set in post-Civil War Texas. Beyond this, at Disneyland, Walt designed entire lands themed to subjects of American history. One land based on colonial Boston, another on the Louisiana Purchase, yet another to depict how America changed from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. These three lands together, which were never built, at least as Walt originally imagined them, would depict the history of America from its inception up through the start of the 20th century. During the mid-1950s, Larry Watkin came to better understand Walt's development style as an executive producer and as a studio head. Walt's emphasis was on story development. Even as Walt began to trust directors more, he still oversaw story development for months or sometimes years before a director or producer was brought onto the project. In the 1930s and 1940s, Walt had spent months in story meetings discussing and acting out each scene until the narrative had sharply defined characters and a clearly arranged plot ready to be boarded out for an animated film. For animated features, he typically worked with 6 to 10 story artists seated around a long table where they took turns proposing changes and additions, with Walt typically offering the most and often most useful suggestions for the story. A person from the steno pool typed up notes which, like a script or a courtroom transcript, presented the entire discussion word for word. For live action, however, Walt typically worked one-on-one with writers such as Larry Watkin, allowing them to develop detailed treatments or even a whole script before offering suggestions. Unlike the earlier and more formal story development meetings for animated features, meetings with Larry Watkin and other live-action screenwriters were more casual, where a treatment or a script was presented and then followed by page-by-page suggestions from Walt. In summing up Walt's approach to live-action development, Bill Cottrell said, Walt's contribution was reading the script over and over, and not just reading through it and making a couple of things and saying, okay, let's go. He worked on them with the writers. This style of early collaboration would define Walt's involvement with live action for the rest of his life. Even when he created musicals in the 1960s, such as Mary Poppins and The Happiest Millionaire, he worked with the songwriters to mock up and revise early treatments and to define the music long before anyone else was brought on board. In terms of his evolving role at the studio, this practice allowed Walt great control over content by developing script and song materials before handing a project over to a director. As Walt worked with more experienced directors, or as Disney's set of existing directors such as Ken Anakin became more experienced, he found that they demanded more independence. Working with writers early gave Walt reasonable control over the shape of a film. It also allowed him to hand a project to a director with an understanding that the story would adhere to the proposed script, even if the director slightly altered its meaning by interpreting how actors delivered the material in front of the camera. During this same period, as Watkin scripted out material based on American history, he helped adapt his work for TV, including for the Mickey Mouse Club. As with most Disney employees, Watkin's work wasn't limited to just one area, such as feature films, but rather to any project where Walt thought his expertise would be valuable. In 1955, Watkin saw his novel Marty Markham adapted for a TV serial, eventually to be called Spinnin' Marty. Though some early work was done by Watkin, the final scripts were written by Jackson Gillis, who specialized in family TV series such as The Adventures of Superman and Lassie. During the final months of 1955, a typical episode of the Mickey Mouse Club featured a few minutes of singing, a few minutes of animation, and one 10 to 15-minute episode of Spinnin' Marty, the ongoing story of two boys, the wealthy Marty and the relatively poor Spin, who spend a summer together at a dude ranch. There they learn lessons about growing up and about creating community with people from different economic backgrounds. Walt promised that Watkin's book would be heavily promoted with the TV serial, even though Watkin would receive little from Disney directly. "This is the book the series is based upon," Walt said. "You'll get all kinds of royalties." The first season of Spin' Marty was filmed over summer when its young stars were on break from school. As Disney didn't have a full backlot similar to MGM or Warner, they leased land 25 miles north of the Burbank studio, just outside of the Angeles National Forest. The parcel, called the Golden Oak Ranch, was filled with oak trees, rolling foothills, and a stream that moved across the property. There, Disney created sets for the summer camp, including barns where Spin' Marty kept their horses. The studio would later film other projects at Golden Oak, including Old Yeller and Toby Tyler. The first season of Spin' Marty was a success, a show that brought in bags of fan mail for its two teenage stars. For Watkin, the show was, from the perspective of book sales, a minor disappointment. The name of his novel was simply included in the closing credits where hardly anyone would notice it. "The book was never advertised on the screen or elsewhere," Watkin said. As a result, very few kids even knew about Watkin's novel, let alone bought a copy, even though Whitman Publishing produced a special series tie-in edition with an image of the show's stars on its hardbound cover. Still, the TV serial attracted an audience of millions who enjoyed material that Watkin had written in the early 1940s. With the success of Spin' Marty, Watkin was asked to develop sequels for the TV series, The New Adventures of Spin' Marty and The Further Adventures of Spin' Marty. These shows as well would garner millions of fans, even if they didn't make Watkin a best-selling novelist. As Spin' Marty continued to entertain kids, in 1957, Watkin saw his first novel, On Borrowed Time, adapted once more, this time for TV. The TV version featured Ed Wynn as Grandpa Northrop. Wynn himself was well known around the Disney studio as the voice of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. On Borrowed Time was aired as part of the Hallmark Hall of Fame, a show with high production values. It was one of the first programs to regularly telecast in color years before the popularity of color sets. Once more, the presentation was well received, with one review saying that the play was brilliantly produced and acted. By this point, Watkin had been with Disney for a decade, a period of time during which he'd seen Walt entirely remake the studio. When Watkin had arrived at the studio in the late 1940s, the Disney studio was mostly focused on animation. But in the years that followed, Walt quickly expanded out its offerings. He released a series of nature documentaries called The True Life Adventures, as well as a series of cultural documentaries called People and Places. He created multiple live-action features each year. For TV, he developed a weekly anthology show, the Daily Mickey Mouse Club Show, also a dramatic series, Zorro, starring heartthrob Guy Williams. Outside of screen entertainment, Walt invented an entirely new type of amusement park, one where the themed lands resembled backlot sets at various Hollywood studios. In most of Disney's design and production areas, Walt had a small group of individuals who were not only key employees but also close friends. In animation, these people were Mark Davis and Ward Kimball. In theme park design, these were individuals like Herb Ryman and John Hench. In TV, these were producers like Bill Anderson and Bill Walsh. In live-action features, it was largely Larry Watkin. For that first decade of Disney live-action films, production was often arranged on a tight schedule. As a script was being finished, Walt quickly moved to hire a director and a cast. In 1957, though, Watkin noticed a slight production slowdown, not only at the Disney studio, but around Hollywood in general. In the mid-1950s, Disney released 4 feature films per year, but in the late 1950s, as the booming post-war economy eased toward a minor recession, Disney reduced its offerings to 3 features a year. During this lull, Watkin's attention was drawn back to his original assignment, the Darby O'Gill stories, which now flew yet under another title, The Three Wishes of Darby O'Gill. The script still lacked unity as it was based on multiple short stories, each with its own plot. But in thinking about the script for Darby, Watkin was reminded of one of his own short stories, entirely unrelated to leprechauns, published in Collier's magazine many years earlier, the story of a night watchman who was fired when he turned 65 years old. Unable to tell his wife, he returned to work each night to accompany the new watchman and hopefully prove his worth. In reading it, Watkin sensed a connection between this story and Darby O'Gill. A plot structure similar to that of his own short story, Watkin believed, could establish the frame narrative for the Darby O'Gill material. Darby would be an elderly caretaker of a large Irish estate about to lose his job to a younger man. The concept would make Darby immediately sympathetic, having lost his job due to his age, and would give the story an overriding quest, that is, for Darby to prove himself valuable and retain his position, while including many stories now arranged as subplots from the original Darby O'Gill short stories. I suggested that Darby O'Gill would be the caretaker of an estate owned by a wealthy but benevolent Englishman named Fitzpatrick, Watkin said. Fitzpatrick seldom visits his Irish preserve, but when he does, he wants it spick and span. Darby's daughter, Katie, does more than her part keeping things shipshape, but Darby would rather tell stories about the little people in the local pub. Fitzpatrick appears without notice, bringing a fine young man to take over. And that, Watkin believed, would anchor the plot for the entire film. The story of an older man who loves folk stories, trying to keep his job and also maintain the respect of his 20-year-old daughter. As he worked through the material, Watkin added more dramatic elements such as a love story between Darby's daughter and the man destined to replace him. He thought that the young man, now smitten by Katie, might agree to pretend to be Darby's assistant, as Darby was too proud to tell his daughter that he'd lost his job. Around this story, Watkin arranged the sections with the little people to solve both Darby's problems and those his daughter faced in romance. In this way, Watkin was gently guiding Walt away from a heavy reliance on well-known classics, historical epics, and fairy tales, and toward original material. Some sections of Darby O'Gill would be based on the Kavanaugh short stories, but in this new version, Watkin added original elements and subplots not to be found anywhere in the stories that initially inspired Walt. Watkin was, in small ways, suggesting that Walt finally was ready to move toward original narratives to make a grander picture than what he had originally envisioned. In the final credits, the film would not claim that the script was an adaptation of the Kavanaugh stories, rather that the film was suggested by those stories. After explaining his new plan to organize the Darby O'Gill material with an original plot, Walt leaned into Watkin. "Write it up," he said. "We'll shoot it." In the weeks that followed, Watkin worked through the story many times, understanding that Walt would likely support this film with a generous budget. Years earlier, Watkin had seen the leprechaun story as something in the vein of Snow White or Pinocchio, but while doing research, he came to understand that the Irish had a different relationship to their fairy tales than did most people in continental Europe or in America. He came to this realization slowly, after reviewing stories he had heard in Ireland. In one story, a man supposedly still living planted potatoes close to a rumored stronghold of the fairies, only to contract pneumonia that winter as a type of supernatural punishment. Then there was a story about a farmer who tried to stone up the entrance to a rumored underground stronghold for the fairy folk, only to break his leg in the process. This brought Watkin to an understanding that there was a categorical difference to how people in Ireland related to fairy stories compared to those who lived elsewhere in the Western world. Well, Our fairies are only in children's books, Watkin explained, but a child in County Kerry, for example, may view dwelling places of fairies every day by looking out the window or the open door. That is for most of the Western world. Fairy stories inhabit a different time and place than do readers. The only way to enjoy the experience of a fairy tale is to read a book or watch a movie. But for the Irish, fairy and folk tales are ongoing experiences and narratives that not only reside in books, but in the world around them, with the stories continuing to evolve into the present day. Once Watkin understood this, he saw the ongoing drama between the humans and the fairy folk as the centerpiece touchstone of his script. In other Disney films, from Snow White to Cinderella to Sleeping Beauty, the magical fairies not only lived in a world far from viewers, they often lived in the distant past. Some of the wonder in Watkin's approach to Darby was that the leprechauns and the other spirits lived alongside Irish people in the early years of the 20th century, that is, only a few decades before the film was made. The finished script presented not only the story of an individual man, but the story of an entire culture, or rather, of an entire culture slowly passing away as the modern world gradually enters rural Ireland. The script now included stories from the Kavanagh book, also stories that Watkin had heard while in Ireland. With this, the project developed yet another name for the film, one that emphasized the relationship between humans and the fairy folk, Darby O'Gill and the Little People. This time, the title stuck. After Walt read the script, his secretary, Dolores Scott, called Watkin. "Larry," she said, "I think I should tell you this, because Walt is constitutionally incapable of telling anyone that he has been pleased. But when he finished your final script for Darby O'Gill, he told me, that's the best screenplay I've read in 30 years. With a finished script, production moved quickly in multiple directions. One direction was to task mechanical and special effects wizards from both WED, the theme park design company, and the studio's various special effects divisions to develop techniques and strategies to create believable leprechauns on screen. The plan to animate the leprechauns had long ago been replaced with an updated and more expensive plan to build massive sets to make human actors appear small. Beyond large-scale sets, the film would need other strategies to create a range of believable effects, as Watkin's script included almost every type of spirit he'd researched in Ireland. Not only leprechauns, but also a banshee, the death coach, and its puka. The work to create these visual wonders would involve many people. Effects animator Josh Meter would create ghostly animation around spirits and bolts of electricity that flew from the fingers of leprechauns. Painter Peter Ellenshaw would create mats that transformed a shooting location in California into a quaint turn-of-the-century location in Ireland. Set designer Emil Curry would design oversized props and sets so that full-size people would appear tiny next to a 6-foot-tall pot of gold. And camera engineer Ub Iwerks would develop lenses, filters, and lighting procedures that would allow for human actors playing leprechauns to appear tiny on screen, even when they were standing next to a full-sized Darby O'Gill. Another direction involved set design. Though Disney regularly rented Golden Oak Ranch as a shooting location, it lacked outdoor sets that could be easily painted and dressed to fit needs of an upcoming movie. Rather than rent time at a nearby studio, such as at Fox, which was where Disney had previously shot some movies, Walt elected to develop an Irish village on empty land toward the back of the Disney studio. The studio now had a natural berm around it, which was a 6-foot wall of dirt that created a visual screen between the suburban lot and the neighborhood down the street. Disney had received this dirt for free, as it was largely fill dug out of local neighborhoods as residents created backyard pools. The pool companies needed a place to dump the dirt, and Disney offered space. Inside this wall of dirt now, Disney craftspeople would build a small village, complete with a pub, church, and a massive 13-foot Gaelic cross. Another team began to design the indoor sets for the Disney sound stages. These sets included Darby's cottage and one that represented the enormous underground kingdom of the Leprechauns, the most complex set Disney had so far attempted inside of a soundstage. With multiple shooting locations, the crew would also need to arrange transportation for actors to move between the outdoor village and the sound stages, which was then perhaps a 10-minute walk. As production would move through late spring and early summer, with temperatures rising into the 80s, Disney arranged for a small fleet of electric carts to shuttle actors from the stages to the outdoor sets, largely to keep them cool and to protect their costumes from dirt and damage. Yet another direction was selecting the cast and hiring the crew. For director, Walt hired Bob Stevenson, who had worked with Disney for 2 years, first directing episodes of Zorro, then later directing the films Johnny Tremaine and Old Yeller, which was a hit at the box office. Stevenson had been born in England in 1905, but unlike Walt and most of the Western world, he didn't see his first movie until 1927. From there, he fell in love with the cinema and looked to a career at English studios. He started as a script reader, then a script writer, then became a director. In 1939, he came to Hollywood to work with David O. Selznick, a career that shifted into TV, including Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Gunsmoke. Then, in 1956, he was hired on at Disney's. He was nearly the same age as Walt. They shared similar life experiences, and with the success of his early Disney films, particularly Old Yeller, he became one of Walt's favorite directors. In ways, Stevenson arrived on the Disney lot at the exact right time, 6 years after the release of the studio's first fully live-action feature. In the years since Treasure Island, Walt had slowly learned to trust directors more, giving them more leeway and control. The experiences of Byron Haskin on Treasure Island and Bob Stevenson on Old Yeller were entirely different. Whereas Haskin felt that Walt was micromanaging Treasure Island at a distance, Stevenson believed that Walt, now more experienced and comfortable with live action, gave him plenty of creative control once the cameras started rolling. Walt was close to writing and editing, but not to shooting, Stevenson said. I never felt that if I had a good idea, Walt would turn it down flat. Stevenson also felt that Walt, compared to other producers, was particularly good at developing story, though for Disney this largely meant talking through individual scenes or even acting them out in his office. He would really be doing an awful lot of writing, Stevenson said, even though he didn't put it on paper. Walt would simply talk or act through a scene and then expect Larry Watkin or another screenwriter to capture those plot points and create polished dialogue. In this, Stevenson was watching Walt become a more mature studio head, a person who was arriving at a point where he contributed in his area of strength, which was story development, and then delegated other assignments along with a good deal of autonomy to those in leadership positions. Compared to Old Yeller or Johnny Tremaine, Stevenson felt that Darby's biggest challenge would be with its many special effects shots. Like Walt, Stevenson was a planner, choosing to deeply think through a filming schedule so that each shot was clearly planned out in his mind. But for this film, which would require unique props, endless matte paintings, animated effects subsequently added to a scene, unusual sets, and trick camera work, he couldn't hold the entire plan in his mind. To map out this film, he needed to work out many shots on paper. Specifically, he wanted to plan out complicated sequences with storyboards at a far deeper level than had been used for previous Disney live-action features. This level of planning would also help manage production costs. I first suggested the use of storyboards for live action on Darby O'Gill. The trick stuff made it necessary, Stevenson said. I asked Walt, how about I storyboard this? Walt thought about it, then nodded his head. Fine, I'll get you someone to do it. From this point forward, Darby O'Gill was planned out as if it were an animated film, with a story artist from the Disney Story Department sketching out the movement of characters and effects moment by moment for the most complicated sequences. In this, Stevenson could track how scenes would be arranged with lighting, unique lenses, oversized props, mats, and sections of post-production effects animation. As opposed to the structure of the UK films, Walt decided not to hire a producer, even though Bill Anderson, who had recently completed Old Yeller, could have easily done it. Walt was now developing a different relationship with Stevenson than he had with other directors. For Johnny Tremaine, Walt functioned as an uncredited producer of the movie. He decided to do the same for Darby O'Gill, in which he oversaw business and casting decisions and then left production mostly to the director. In short, more so than with other directors, Walt got along well with Stevenson. They often understood the world around them in similar ways. The final element of pre-production concerned casting, something that once again Walt wanted a hand in, as this film, now nearly 12 years in the making, would need the exact right actors to bring its cultural fantasy to life. The act of casting would once more bring Walt back to London and Ireland in the hopes of finding an ideal cast, just as he, Perce Pearce, Larry Watkin, and Ken Anakin had done for those early UK pictures. Darby O'Gill would be another story of the British Isles, though this time the picture wouldn't be filmed in England, it would be filmed in California, where dozens of studio workers would recreate a small Irish village and the underground kingdom of the leprechauns. It would be there that Walt oversaw one of his most significant live-action projects, a film that eventually would come out at the end of the 1950s. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And for those of you who look ahead, now that we're on to Darby O'Gill, we're nearly to the end of the story about Walt, Larry Watkin, and the first wave of Disney live-action features. Also, over on Bandcamp, I'm moving more of our multi-part series into albums so that listeners can enjoy them as one continuous presentation. As Bandcamp sends out a notice when each new album is posted, I am only combining these up once a week to limit the number of email notices supporters get from the service. This week, I'm combining up a series called Landscaping a Kingdom, which is the 3-part story of Ruth Shellhorn, the first female designer of Disneyland, and Jack and Bill Evans, exotic plant specialists, who through conflict and frustration struggle to finish Disneyland before its grand opening. So, if you're on Bandcamp, you likely just got a message about that album this morning in addition to the episode you just listened to about Walt, Watkin, and Darby O'Gill. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available in iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.